Hey guys, it is Sunday night. It has been a long weekend. I missed you guys on Friday. As some of you know, my little guy is sick, so I was hoping to be with you guys today, but if you are watching this video, I probably had to stay home with my son. So I have recorded this video in the case that I won't be there, but I'm really hoping I'll get to be there, so fingers crossed. Today we're going to talk about watercolor. I love watercolor painting, but I didn't always. I know a lot of people are intimidated by watercolor painting. So to begin, I just want to talk about some techniques we use with watercolors and kind of give you the fundamentals. So hopefully your experience will be really positive and you'll feel confident that you can make what you want in watercolor paint. So to begin, you should have some supplies. They're written on the board, which you guys can see. They're over there. I don't know if you can read that part, but if you move your little eyes over, you'll see those. And I'm going to tilt my camera so you can see what I'm working with here. But this is what you guys should have. So I have my little sheet of paper. I got that off the cart. And I have my watercolor paint set. This sheet of paper is 4.5 by 4 inches. From your supply, you should have your ruler, your pencil, your 2 different brush sizes. You've got these previously, and they're hopefully stored safely in your supply. If you need to borrow any of these items, over behind me in the shelf are some rulers and pencils, and then there are a few brushes below the watercolors on the cart if you need to borrow them. If you borrow anything today for this assignment, please return it as good or in better condition than you found it. Best practice for anything you borrow ever. And then you'll need a piece of paper towel. We've got rolls of paper towel floating around on the different desks. So get set up, get what you need. If you need to pause this video, do that. So we're all on the same page, and then I'll go through how I want you to mark out your paper. We're going to do some little thumbnails on one side and then kind of get a little bit more into it on the back, and I'll talk about that in just a second. So pause if you need to. Okay, moving on. We're going to start by ruling out our paper, how we want it to look. So I'm going to have the long side going this way and my short side going this way. So I'm trying to think about how I want to do this. We'll start by taking your ruler and lining it up, and so you've got 4 inches here, right? So I'm going to go down to the 1 inch mark and then 1/4 and make a small mark. Then I'm going to go down another 1/4 inch and make another small mark. So what I'm doing is I'm creating a square for me to paint in and a small small area for me to label what I've painted. And I'm going to come down 1 inch and then mark that 1/4 inch again. I know that means my top squares are going to be a little bigger. That's okay. It just works well to have this size paper, how I cut down our pieces. So it's a little bit weird, but it'll work out. It just means that top square is about 1/4 inch bigger. Like I said, not a big deal. So that's 1 inch and 1/4 inch. Then come down, mark another inch. So it's actually, you're sitting at, what, 2 3/4. So 1/4 is going to bring you to 3 inches. And then another 1 2 3/4 brings you to that 1 inch mark. And that'll leave a 1/4 inch section at the bottom. Then I'm going to draw my lines, right? So straight-ish. This is just practice, so if it's not perfect, that is not the end of the world. The idea is that we just have a space for us to work with. Right? Right. Okay. So once I've marked that out, you should have have something that looks a bit like this. So hopefully your paper looks like my paper. Then the next thing we need to do is create create 3 sections above. My hope is that you have 9 squares when we end this. So if you have less than 9 squares, you're in a bit of a pickle. You can always start again. There should be a few extra sheets up on the cart. Or erase your marks and start over. Like I said, if you haven't ruled it out perfectly like I have, I don't really care. I just want some approximation where squares are a relative size, and I can see that you understand the technique. So do your best. If it's not perfect, don't freak out. Okay, so I'm going up on that top section now. I'm going to mark out 1.5 inches, right? I apologize. That's 1.25 inches. I want 1.5 inches, so that's 1.5 inches. If I go to 2, that's got my 1/2 inch. Then I go to 3, that's another 1.5 inches, right? So 3, and then it goes perfectly to the end of the paper at 4.5. So if you rule out 1.5 inches at the top of your paper, that will be exactly right. And so at least width-wise, your squares will be the same. Strip them. So this is what you should have now. Hopefully that looks right to you too. Again, this is not totally perfect, and that's okay. This is just practice. So do your best. So now I'm going to label each square. I'm going to follow my grid here. If you don't catch everything I've labeled, you can always label as we go along. I'm going to name the technique before I do it. So pick your poison here. But I like to do it before I go so I know what I'm doing. Also, I'm teaching it, so maybe it's a little easier for me that way. But the first technique we're going to talk about is wet on wet. So I'll mark wet on wet. Then we'll do wet on dry. Then we will do a dry brush technique. Dry brush. Then we will do a graduated wash. G-R-A-D-U-A-T-E-D. If you need the help spelling, wash like you wash your clothes, hopefully. Then we're going to do a 2-color blend. So I did ×2 color blend. Stippling. You should remember this from when we did our topography project. We talked about creating value in pen. Stippling is a good way to do that, and I'll go into more detail when I actually do it. Blotted, B-L-O-T-T-E-D. And then I want you to experiment. So the last 2 are your experiments. You'll label them when you actually do them. Okay, so first technique. I've got my water, right? We're going to do a wet on wet technique. I'm going to take my larger brush, keep this brush dry. We want it dry for when we do our dry brush technique. So the first 2 I'm going to do with my bigger brush. So I'm going to pick a color. It doesn't really matter what. I am pretty fond of red, but to get started, I want to activate my paints, right? So they're dry cakes right now, so I want to get them wet because that helps start the paint. So I'm getting into my red. I'm going to clean my brush, dry it on my paper, start again so all that pigment's out. Maybe I'll do some blue too, just so I have some options, get some water in there, mixing it around to activate the paint. Maybe I'll do yellow, purple, I'm just gonna do all the colors. That's all I have problems with making choices. I don't love a monochromatic palette. I want all the colors. I'll even get in that black. Those paints are now pre-moistened, ready to go. So wet on wet means that I'm going to paint my watercolor paints on a wet surface. We do this when we create a wash, and what will happen, I'll try to get in so you guys can see. I'm getting a real snug like, is I'm going to paint a nice even layer of water, right? And then I'm going to drop in my color. And what's going to happen is the color is going to begin to bloom. You'll understand what that means once you see what it looks like. So here's my paper. I'm going to drop in that color. Ooh, I don't have enough water on my paper. Can't see what I'm doing. Just kidding. Do over. It's very dramatic if I get this right. Okay, you ready? So it's wet on the paper, there's a layer of water, you drop in the color, and then you can see it creates kind of like a little flower, right? Keep dropping it in. You can see it starts to bleed into everywhere where I have moisture. Do it on that other side too. There's some orange, right? If I go back and forth, that's going to create a wash. Wash just meaning a light filling in of the color all around. Maybe I'll drop in another little blue just to see. Very atmospheric, right? Not as much control. Kind of beautiful and fun. It's what watercolor is really known for, right? It's those beautiful luscious blooms. So that's a wet on wet technique. Now we're going to go wet on dry. And probably a lot of you have already caught on. Wet on dry just means that instead of pre-wetting my surface, I'm going to take my moistened paints and I'm going to paint them directly on my paper. A lot of control there, right? Getting that nice, crisp, clean line. It doesn't go anywhere I don't tell it to. And depending on how much water I add to my paint, I can make it very opaque or transparent, right? So I'm going to clean my brush a little bit, my paper, and you can see I can get that green pretty transparent. I can also get that blue really dark. It's good for those detail spaces, right? Maybe I'll do some branches in there too, just so you guys can see. You see, even with my thick brush, I can get pretty detailed. I don't care what you put in here. You can do tree branches, you can do shapes filled in, that's fine. I always like to try more than one color just because the colors are a little bit different, so I get an idea about what the others can do. And there's some value in this, doing it if I was using a different paint set, like I've never used these prangs before. So it was really helpful for me to just kind of mess with them a little bit before I get started and actually try to paint a painting with them, right? So this is a good way to test your paints too if you're not sure what you're working with. Okay, so now I'm going to switch brushes. I had been using my big brush. I'm going to switch to my little brush. And the reason why is because I'm going to try a dry brush technique. So dry brush means that there's a little bit of pigment on a dry brush, and the reason why you might like to do that is because it creates kind of a feathered effect. So I'm just going to grab a little bit of the blue paint onto the end, right? So just enough to kind of get the tip a little bit full of paint, but not so much that it fills into the barrel of the brush, because the idea is that I'm going to get a lot of texture with this technique. So I want to see those brush strokes. I want to see the texture of the paper. So don't fill your paintbrush so full that it's making a clean line. The idea is that it's going to be super textured, and that's what we're working towards here. I'll pick up a little bit of green. This works really well for doing things like grass. In our picture that we're going to do later, we're going to use it to kind of capture some reflections, but you'll see start to get kind of a nice brushy looking look to it. I'll try it from the top too, just grabbing a little bit so that I can see what it looks like, the dry brush technique. So that's dry brush. Here's my wet on wet, wet on dry, dry brush. And I have my cheat sheet here as well. So here's another version of the same. Okay, now we're going to move on to a graduated wash. I'm going to move back to my big brush just because I'm covering a larger area, and so I want to be able to work pretty quick. So just like I did with my wet on wet technique, I'm going to put a layer of water over the top of my square. I don't know if you guys can see this, but probably not. It's actually kind of a sheen of water on top of there. And then I'm going to grab some pigment and spread it really heavy on the top, and then gradually bring it down. So that starts with my darkest value, moving into my lightest. So a lot like we've done with our value scales, but now we're doing it in watercolor paint, right? So I'm going to go green on this, because why not? I've got my brush loaded up with green, right? And I'm just dropping that in heavy as I can, right? And the paint's already starting to do the work for me. I don't know if you can see this, but it's starting to kind of bleed outwards, which is good. That's what I want. So I'm going to go heavy, heavy, heavy through here. So the bulk of my pigment is going to be at the top. Then I'm going to clean my brush, right? Because if I go in with more green on my brush, I'm just going to be putting one value all the way down my square. And the idea here is that I'm going to get a gradient. So I'm going to grab that tone, bring it down just a little bit, right? So I'm just using water. I'm moving my brush from side to side. Bring that down, clean my brush again, move to an area that doesn't have, I'm going to grab a little bit of that green and bring it down. But since my brush is clean and has water on it, it's just going to bring a tiny bit of color down. So that's going to give me, I don't want it, it's a little bit wet, but can you see that gradient there? So darkest, moving down to lighter, lighter, lighter. Right? If I don't have enough, I can always bring from the top. So that's how to do a gradiated wash. Now I'm going to do something really similar, but I'm going to have a color above and a color below, and then I'll blend them kind of in the middle. So that's going to be our two color blend. So again, I'm going to get my paper a little bit wet. And this is part of the reason we use watercolor paper. Watercolor paper is a heavier weight paper, so it can actually deal with all that water. So you should not be using drawing paper for this. You should definitely be using watercolor paper. Hopefully there wasn't any confusion there. I always get a few that are not totally checked in. So you'll know you're messed up if stuff starts bleeding through, right? So I'm laying out some purple, feeling the school spirit today. So I'm going to grab a little bit of purple from the top, yellow on the bottom, drop in that yellow, right? Heavy, heavy, heavy at the bottom. So I got a heavy purple, a heavy yellow, and I'm going to clean my brush, right? And then that's actually too much water. I'm going to dry it on my paper towel. So when you see me moving over here, that's what's happening. I'm actually just deciding how much color or water or whatever I want on my brush, right? So that purple goes a long way. So I want to have a little bit, but not too much, because I don't want it to overpower that yellow. Right, and then I'll bring that yellow right up here. Maybe I need a little more. Of course, yellow is much lighter than purple. It's going to want to be overshadowed, but we don't want that to happen. We want a nice, even blending between the two. Let's bring that purple down just a little to mix with our yellow. We're getting kind of that brownish gray. Clean my brush. Grab a little more yellow. Okay, now we've got two blended colors. So now I'm going to move back to my little brush. We're going to be doing some stippling. I'm going to clean it out because it's got a little bit of paint from my dry brush. But stippling, you'll remember from our pen and ink unit, is where you make little dots to create value. So kind of an example here on mine is I started here, think of like pointillism, where you have a concentration of those little dots, you're going to have a darker value. Where you have less, it's going to be a lighter value. And like I said, I like to experiment with a couple of different colors just to see what they'll do. So I'm going to start with one color on one side and another color on another side, and then kind of meet in the middle just so I get an idea about what my paints are doing. So I'll start with some blue. I'm just going to make some little dots. Pick up a little more paint. Dot, dot, dot. It's okay if this is not perfect. More often than not, we'll use stippling in kind of organic forms anyway. So if they're a little bit uneven or have an atmospheric quality, that's okay. Because that's how nature is too. Get some dots in there, dot, 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 dot. I'm also dealing with paint that's lighter in some spots and darker in some spots, and that's okay too. The idea is we're getting a feel for the paint. So try it out. Try a lot of pigment, a little pigment. This is the spot for you to experiment. So I'm not looking for you to be super uniform. I want to see that you're messing around with the paint and figuring out what it can do, because much better that you experiment here than get into a painting, be totally done, and then get kind of stuck in a spot where you make a mistake or you're not quite sure what to do. So I've got some blue and orange happening here. Maybe I want a darker blue at the top, so I'm going to pick up some more pigment. So I'm actually moving, there's kind of a little puddle of water in my watercolor paints. And I'm picking up a little bit of that water and moving it to part of the drier part of the cake and mixing it around, so I've got a more heavily pigmented bit of paint on my brush. So that's another way to kind of control it. Okay, all said and done, you should have something that looks about like that. It's okay if my two colors are bleeding into my gradient, as long as I can see that you actually got it. They're so close together, so sometimes that happens. You know, just try not to get too crazy with the water, or it's going to bleed all over everything. So keep that in mind. The next thing I want to do is blot. So I've got my paper towel ready to go. I just want you to get an idea of what happens when you lay out a bunch of color and then you pick it back up with a paper towel. And some people use that intentionally, and some people use it to correct a problem. Either way is fine, but I want you to have the skill, right? So I'm going to go in. I got a bunch of red on my brush here. I'm just going to lay out a bunch of red on my square. All right, so it's going to kind of sit on the surface there. Another thing to note with watercolor paints, the paper can take a lot, but I am brushing very lightly because if you're doing a lot of heavy rubbing back and forth, you will pull up the paper. Okay, so I got my red here. You guys can see. I'm going to take my paper towel, wad it up. A lot, right? So a lot of that color has lifted, so you can see. So if I need to make a correction, that's a good way to make a correction. Or if I just like the effect, that's a good way to try out an effect. So for the last two, I'm asking you to experiment. You can try laying out paint, letting it dry, then maybe putting wet paint over the top, just trying out some different things. I'm not super worried about what you do here. I just want to give you an opportunity to play around a little bit. I'm going to actually do two proper techniques just so you can see them. So I've got a little bit of salt here. I'm going to throw some over my left shoulder for good luck. This is coarse kosher salt, and I will leave it on the little side desk to the left of my desk if you're facing me. And then I'm going to try a little hand sanitizer. Fun fact, what makes hand sanitizer so sanitizing is it actually has a bunch of alcohol in it. And alcohol, if you mix it with paint, actually sort of repels the paint. So I'll show you guys what that looks like in a second. But first we're going to start with our salt. Salt's kind of fun with watercolor paints because salt actually absorbs liquid. So everywhere we put the salt is actually going to start sucking up some of the paint. So I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. I'm actually mixing some paints together because why not? Let's do some like purpley blue color. See how that goes. So I'm going to put a heavy layer of paint here, like so. Hopefully we'll get a good look at what that salt can do. To get an idea about what it does on kind of a thinner, lighter application, and then darker up here. So as much as possible, I'm trying to get the most bang for my buck, as it were. So I'm going to go kind of light on the top, a little bit dark on the bottom. And then I'm just going to sprinkle the salt right into that wet paint. It does need to be wet. I don't know if you guys can see on your end, but it's already starting to do its thing. Let's see, where's my camera? It's kind of starting to suck up the paint. You can see the kind of dark purple around the salt crystals. So we'll leave that on there. Let it work its magic here. A little extra water on the salt. So we get a kind of neat effect. Okay, now we'll let that alone to dry. The next thing, last thing I want to do, I'm going to write here salt, so I know what I did, and then I'll write hand sanitizer. I'm actually going to write hand san in the effort of staying brief. Okay, so then comes that question, like, what color do I want to use? What will I be able to see the best? I don't know. Let's mix some red and purple and see how it goes. Kind of getting bored of just using directly out of the thing. So I'll start kind of heavy here. Maybe I'll do a lighter over on this area. I got a little salt. Let's get that out of there. Gonna do that pretty maroony color. Around a little bit. Remember, I'm not going crazy. Slightly carrying the paint over the surface. And then I'm going to put out a little bit of hand sanitizer. On my napkin. I'm just going to drop it and see what it does in the paint. so you guys can see. You can kind of see it. But everywhere I'm dropping that sanitizer, it's actually repelling the paint. So it's kind of a neat technique. We could also spray alcohol and get more of a kind of like galactic looking thing with it. But just to get an idea about what it is. So that is our practice. That's what we're working on today. This video went kind of long, so if you want the whole period, I'm assuming that you probably won't get through all this, and that's okay. Stop wherever you need to. But make sure that you take that last 5 minutes to clean up. So you need to rinse out your water containers. They go up on top of the sink. Clean out your palette. So I did some mixing in my palette, you'll see. So I've got my paper towel, so I'm just going to wipe out that excess color. Maybe use a little water if I need to. So this palette looks really nice for the next person who used it. You should not be blending colors inside the palette. It's bad, bad etiquette. Clean your brushes. If you borrowed one of mine, put it back. If these are yours, clean them out, put them in the supply along with your ruler and pencil. And then paints go back where you found them. You can put your little paper in with your flat storage, and then put your materials away where they go. So hopefully you're not watching this video. Hopefully I'm teaching you this in person, but if not, great job everybody, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow or the next day. See you soon.